Now, as you can see by this New York Times story of March 28th, 1980, there were 35,000 UN war crimes files. The headline on the story is unfortunately fake news. As you can see by the body of the story, my name is mentioned many times. I was the one who actually discovered these 35,000 files. I went to the New York Times, and lo and behold, when the story came out, there was this phony headline about the Justice Department being interested in the files. Well, they didn't know they didn't do anything until I made a fuss out of it with the New York Times. This is the way things are done. The New York Times isn't in the business of making a major department of the federal government look bad, because if they had done nothing, or it was obvious that they did nothing, they would have looked pretty silly. There was an Office of Special Investigations of the Justice Department that was supposed to be after Nazi war criminals in the U.S. Most of those guys were covered up by the CIA, so the OSI of the Justice Department was sitting on their hands, and that's a story in and of itself. Now, what we have here, the next picture shows the index to the files, the 35,000 German, Austrian, Italian, and Japanese war criminals, who in 1979, 1980, we estimate 60% were still alive, and a few were just in the process of retiring from government service in Italy, Japan, West Germany, and Austria. Now, the most important file that was being covered up was this Odluka. Let's call it an indictment against Kurt Waldheim. Now you say, who the heck was Kurt Waldheim? Kurt Waldheim was the Secretary General of the United Nations when I discovered these files. I had no idea that one of the files was on the Secretary General. When I began this particular investigation, I was after the files on the Italian war criminals. Now, how did I get into the UN files? That's a story in and of itself. Now, of course, you're not going to believe this, but I pretended to be working for Kurt Waldheim, who was the Secretary General of the UN, in order to get into the UN archives. I said, I'm from the Secretariat. The Secretariat's upstairs. They said, Secretary General. I nodded my head. He's waiting for the files. One of the files was a war crime file against him. That has to be one of history's most incredible, meaningful coincidences. Now, this file, of course, was known by many governments. That's another big story. Who had the file and who was blackmailing Waldheim with the file? Israel was certainly one of those countries. Another country was Yugoslavia. I went around to all of the missions. Now remember, I'm trying to get into the files for purposes of getting the Italian war crime files, because I was writing a book on Italian war criminals, which later on in 1989 became Fascist Legacy, the story which made headlines and, of course, got me thousands of death threats from Italy. Everything I do always leads to death threats. I don't know why. So anyway, so what you have now is the fact that I'm investigating Italian war crimes. I went to the Yugoslavs, and the Yugoslavs, this was before the New York Times story. I'm going back now. I'm reeling back to describe the background of the New York Times story. I went to the Yugoslavs, and the Yugoslavs contacted their foreign ministry in Belgrade, and they said, we're going to get and then they called me up. We have a message for you from Belgrade. I said, okay, what's the message? They said a file about 10 years ago was sent from the Yugoslavs, because the Yugoslavs have copies of the Yugoslav war crime files, to Washington. And I said, whose file? And they said, we're not allowed to tell you. You already know. Well, what they thought was I already knew about Waldheim. And they thought that my cover story was that I was really interested in Italian war criminals who were committed all these atrocities in Yugoslavia. You see, it was Waldheim who was the German liaisons with the Italians, because he could speak the Italian language. And therefore, Mr. Waldheim had all of these German reports of Italian war crimes. What was the interesting thing was, however, in the German system, the documents were signed Lieutenant Waldheim, not Lieutenant Kurt Waldheim. If they had been signed Lieutenant Kurt Waldheim, I would have realized who it was. I was constantly getting these hits. I showed it to one of my friends, and I said, could this Lieutenant Waldheim be the Secretary General? He says, nah, come on, you're crazy. That's beyond anything in Hollywood. I mean, how could you have a war crime file on the Secretary General of the UN in the UN archives while Waldheim is still the Secretary General? Impossible. And the Yugoslavs thought I knew about Waldheim, and I was getting hints from them that 10 years before, that's when Waldheim was a candidate for Secretary General. The message from Belgrade was they had sent that file to Washington. So what happened was, without naming Waldheim, and I got other hints from Keith Hindle of BBC. We had lunch, and he's telling me about Waldheim, all these rumors that Waldheim was involved in some kind of nasty business during the war, and I just didn't believe any of those particular hints. Now, what you have to understand is I eventually went to the Israelis. Now, I'm going back now in 1979, before the New York Times story. And when I went to the Israelis, I thought very naively, now I was just a child then, it was my first time up at bat. I had no idea that the Israelis were covering up thousands of Nazis for WMDs. I had no idea that the Israelis had a war crime file of the Secretary General. And so I met a guy by the name of Shabtai Rozan, who was the legal expert of the Israelis Foreign Office, who, another tremendous coincidence, just happened to be in New York. So I met him, and he gave me such a grilling that you would never possibly believe. He's trying to find out how much I know. And it's a classic story of someone who just blundered into something. I didn't know. I was getting hints that Waldheim's file was there in the UN archives, but I didn't believe it. And of course, at this particular point, I didn't know about the dirty deal between Israel and West Germany for WMDs to cover up thousands of Nazis at the time. Eichmann trial. Shabtai Rozan had been a major figure, believe it or not, in the Eichmann trial. So he's talking to me about the Eichmann trial, and he's telling me about the problems they had with Germany, without revealing anything, of course. Looking into my eyes, trying to figure out, did I know about the dirty deal at the time of the Eichmann trial? Did I know about Waldheim? It was a tragedy of misunderstanding. And then I couldn't get anything out of him. He refused to help me to get into the war crime files. Of course, the Israelis already had the files in Yad Vashem. Yad Vashem is their Holocaust Research Institute in Israel. Then another incredible coincidence. In New York at that time, I had a PhD. I had recently received my PhD from the City University of New York. And a guest speaker there was Gideon Hausner. Gideon Hausner was the guy in the Eichmann trial who was the chief prosecutor. Oh, he was such a big hero for prosecuting Eichmann. If only those Jewish people who paid all that money to come and see him realized the truth, that he had covered up thousands of Nazis, it would have been really something. So Gideon Hausner plays the game. You have 35,000 files. We didn't know about it. And I said, yes, can you talk to Shabtai Rozan and get the UN mission in New York to help me act? Oh, yes. Oh, but we need a report. We have to act on written information. You've got to write out everything you know. Foolishly, I told them everything I knew. And I gave it to them. And then, you see, the New York Times story came out, March 28th, 1980. And then all hell broke loose. Shabtai Rozan called me up. He made it very clear, you must never, never, never do any more publicity on this subject. And then that was the first phone call. It was pretty bad. The second phone call was far worse. He calls me up, wakes me up in the morning, and he gives me another browbeating. You're a troublemaker, blah, blah, blah. Why are you doing this to the Israeli government? Well, the point was, you see, there was a guy, Frank Olson. Frank Olson had been murdered by the CIA because the CIA thought he would reveal what the CIA had done with the Japanese war criminals. The Japanese war criminals, some of them, had dropped bio weapons of mass destruction on China. the United States grabbed them but didn't put them on trial. They used them to drop bioweapons on North Korea. Ha! You're not supposed to know that. Oh, that's a big secret. Well, that big secret cost Frank Olson his life. He was a great American hero. And the point is, would the Israelis have bumped me off if they thought I would reveal that they were blackmailing the Secretary General? If they thought that I would reveal the dirty deal they had about covering up Nazis for weapons of mass destruction? Well, I don't think they would have shown any more restraint than the CIA did with Frank Olson. And then, of course, Shabtai Rozan. Now, remember, this is after the New York Times story came out, and he's very frantic. And he uses the magic words, "We know where you are." Well, I took that to be a death threat. You know why? Because that's what it was. Now, remember, what's going on here is that I don't want to use the word chickened out, but I think that his warnings had certain effects on me. And let us say, for various reasons, I did not pursue this story. Now, in 1986, however, the secret of Waldheim's war crime file was in fact revealed when he left the UN, and at this particular point in 1986, he's running for the office of President of Austria. And that was the cue for certain Jewish organizations to agitate about his war crime file. So I went to London to the New York Times. There's all kinds of stuff about Waldheim's war crime file. And I said, hey, you did a story about me in 1980. I was the source of that story. March 28, 1980. Look it up. And they said, yeah, we know all about it. And I did a very, very foolish thing. I told them that I was that I had been threatened by the Israelis. And once they heard that the Israelis wanted to cover up the true nature of these files and what Israel had done, they dropped me like a hot potato, of course. You can't expect the New York Times to write any stories hostile to Israel. However, in London, Keith Hindle, he was a BBC correspondent from 1980, remembered me, and I got a half page in the London Times about Waldheim, ? Over Israel. Was Israel blackmailing Waldheim? What was Israel doing about the 35,000 files? Why hadn't Israel done anything about war criminals for so many, many years? And then, of course, I mentioned Tom Segev, the #1 journalist in Israel, did a story about me, which he spoke to Shabtai Rozan. He spoke to Gideon Hausner. Remember, those are the two guys involved in the Eichmann situation back in 1961, who just happened to be in New York at the time that I was doing my investigations in 1979 and 1980. Now, there was, however, a different Israeli ambassador to the United Nations in 1986, a fellow by the name of Benjamin Netanyahu, who saw this as a great opportunity to ingratiate himself and advance himself, because even then they were talking about him as a future prime minister of Israel. So the first thing he does is damage control. He knows that I have this story in the London Times. He knows that I have a story with Tom Segev in Israel. He knows that he thinks that maybe somebody in the American news media might pop up with the truth and allow me to go on television or radio or on the pages of a major newspaper and tell the story that it was in fact the Israelis who were covering up the 35,000 war crime files, and it was the Israelis who were blackmailing Waldheim. So Mr. Netanyahu makes a statement, and he makes a statement in the New York Times, and he says he denounces the unnamed person, that's me of course, who is going around with a conspiracy theory that countries may have discovered Mr. Waldheim's background when he became Secretary General. Israel assumed that the record of Mr. Waldheim, a former Austrian diplomat, had to be clean. Well, that is total nonsense. That is total nonsense, because Israel always does what it does, what other countries do. When someone is nominated for an important position like that, they check their files. Israel has Yad Vashem, Yad Vashem has the 35,000 files. They probably knew even before he ran for Secretary General. They probably knew when he was Austrian Foreign Minister, or maybe even before that, that he had this odluka from the indictment against him by the Yugoslav government. And Netanyahu was not satisfied with simply denouncing me, this unnamed person. He goes on and sees this as a wonderful opportunity for him to score some points. Now, remember, it's impossible that Netanyahu was telling the truth when he said that his government didn't know about the war crime, 35,000 files, because I had gone to his embassy in 1980 and begged them to do something. There surely was a record of that. So his story was really terrible. What got me was when he goes to the UN archives and practically cries over these 35,000 files, and he's bemoaning the fact that governments had not done anything about it, and he played the role of the offended party. We, the Israelis, want the truth to come out, and it was disgusting. It turned my stomach when I had to. I've never seen such an example of shameless hypocrisy. Now, Mr. Netanyahu claimed that it is inconceivable for the UN to continue to shield Nazi war criminals. But it was Israel, not the UN, that had been covering up Nazi war criminals. And as I said, when I went to see them in 1980, they refused to help me to open up the files because they already had the files and were blackmailing the West Germans, blackmailing the CIA, blackmailing Waldheim with all of that particular information. So this is an example of Mr. Netanyahu's shameless hypocrisy on a subject that I don't think it's appropriate for a diplomat of Israel to be playing that particular game. Now, Mr. Netanyahu wanted to get particular favor with the New York Jewish community by, you see, you have to understand, in those days, in the 1970s, 1980s, the Jewish community in New York was very upset about the UN resolution, which equated Zionism with racism. And they were very, very upset about that. And so Mr. Netanyahu says that he is going to show people how to agitate against that particular resolution. When the resolution was announced, the Israeli delegate to the UN, wasn't Mr. Netanyahu at that time, ripped it up in front of the audience. The American UN delegate, Patrick Moynihan, denounced it. This is terrible, this is shameless, blah, blah, blah. Now, so what Mr. Netanyahu said in 1986, that his campaign to open up the UN war crime files, which was complete nonsense, could, quote, serve as a model we should use in our fight against the UN resolution which equates Zionism with racism. And now, there was all kinds of stuff going on, all kinds of pressure being put on me. I remember I went to see all kinds of games by the New York Times. I remember I went to see a UN official to try to discuss with him this question of the UN war crime files, and he said something I didn't like. I said something that he didn't like. I implied that maybe the UN was in itself should be doing more to make a statement about the fact that it was Israel who was really the guilty party in this, and rather than the UN. And he says, oh yeah? So he opens up a drawer, he takes out a file and throws it in front of me. It's the New York Times file on me. It's about that thick. These guys knew what I ate for breakfast when I was 7 years old. And yet, of course, they were following me, tapping my phone, but they would not put one word about me in any of the major American news media. So this is what was going on. And of course, Netanyahu was involved in all of this. And I don't think it's appropriate for a person who is Prime Minister of Israel to have a background of covering up Nazis and blackmailing the Secretary General with a war crime file. Now, he did, however, Mr. Netanyahu, denounce Alice Brunner. Alice Brunner was a The one guy that they claimed who was a Nazi who was in the Arab world. That's what he wanted to focus on. Not the thousands of Nazis in West Germany, not the hundreds of Nazis working for the CIA. He wanted to focus on Alice Brunner. And he's going on and on. And of course, every word that he says is repeated without contradiction in the New York Times. I'm sure the New York Times realized by now that the whole thing was phony. All I had to do was read the original story they had done about me in 1980. And Netanyahu claims that opening up the UN archives to public scrutiny will compel reluctant governments to act. Compel reluctant governments to act. I don't know any government more reluctant to pursue war criminals than the government of the State of Israel. Now, it was, in fact, government service that was on Mr. Netanyahu's mind. This was all a shameless campaign of hypocrisy to ingratiate himself in preparation for going back to Israel and for political reasons. And even the Jewish world, this was a Jewish newspaper, local Jewish newspaper in New York, I recognized that Netanyahu's campaign about the New York UN records, quote, can only rebound to Netanyahu's benefit as he leaves here next year to enter Israel's political wars. And then Newsweek said an unkind thing about him, at least one of the rare occasions when American news media would do something like that. And Newsweek reported that, quote, persons in the hunt for Nazis have complained privately that Netanyahu's political ambitions lead him to exaggerate the importance of the file. So this is a man who's doing all these phony posturing about the Holocaust, the murder of 6 million of his own people, which he's using not only to promote the interest of the State of Israel, but more importantly, from his point of view, his own political career. Shameless. Now, we talk about the Holocaust. It is, in fact, these weapons of mass destruction which threaten the Arab world with a new Holocaust, the Holocaust that could reign from missiles launched from the submarines. And we have to realize that why is the Middle East destabilized? The Middle East is destabilized mostly because of the threat posed to the Arab states by the Israel, and part of their nuclear force are the submarines, the German submarines, which they got for covering up the Nazis, from which they can launch nuclear-tipped missiles at most of the Arab capitals, or I should say Muslim capitals, because we have to include Iran. Now, this is really the reason why the Middle East is destabilized. I also will, in the Section 3, mention some other actions by Israel that destabilize the Muslim world. But in Section 3, what I mostly want to do is reveal for the first time some information that has come into my possession about Israel's nuclear program, and this includes information not available anywhere else.